Welcome to How to Be a Person, a podcast about life, with me, your host, Giuliano Grimaudo. Joel, what's up, my friend?
Not much. How's it going?
It's going well, man. I appreciate you coming on today. If anybody, this is their first episode, I really like to just kind of go into these with a blank slate. And so I don't really know much about Joel, just a little bit. And so Joel, would you mind, for me and for anybody listening, just kind of giving us a little bit more info about you, and we'll, go from there.
Sure. So, I also have a podcast. So I'm a philosophy podcaster from Nowhere to Nothing.
Okay.
And on that show, my co-host and I like to usually look at one word, maybe two words. We talk about it for a whole hour. So we'll go over like the formative aspects, like what philosophers have said about it in the past. We'll do some philosophizing ourselves, and then we'll ask kind of speculative questions about what the impacts are for humanity and stuff. So that's my podcast. I'm a PhD student in psychology. So getting into my final year here, about to start my dissertation stuff. So getting pretty close to finishing up, which is good. I love going to school. But it's I'm ready for a break at the end of this. I'm also a village trustee where I live, so I'm heavily involved in local government. I supervise public safety, so the fire and police committees, as well as parks and recreation, and on a local waterfront advisory board. And I'm a production
Where do you
manager.
live, by the way? You don't have to share if you don't want to, but just approximately.
Yeah, Western New York. So kind of like
Okay.
Buffalo, where they get like 6 feet of snow in a day. Like I'm pretty close to there. So
Okay.
We've had pretty good weather lately, but there's still some snow on the ground. So yeah, and then I'm a musician. I've got, I think, 5 albums online, a bunch of different singles and stuff. And I like doing other artwork. I released a book last year, so I wrote a novel and released that. I like to paint. I like to 3D print. I like to do new stuff. I like to do anything, really.
Yeah.
So I stay busy. But yeah,
I love it, man.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah.
I didn't. So like I said, I don't really know much, but from what I'm hearing, I'm loving it. I love it. So, just kind of like first thing off the bat. Well, first of all, I'm in Arizona, and it's normally like super hot here. And yet, not yesterday, the day before, it was just like pouring rain for like 8 hours straight, which is kind of like, that's super uncommon. Like, even if it does rain, it'll rain for like a really short amount of time. So the temperature dropped, and what's crazy is some of the mountains that we can see nearby, like I can see they're like snow capped now, which is amazing. Like, I literally have never seen that once here in Arizona, so it's amazing.
Yeah, I was in the area in October. We flew into Phoenix.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, we did some stuff in Arizona, and then we went up. My uncle lives in Utah, so we were there a little bit, and we went into New Mexico and Colorado. And it's pretty wild. You fly into Phoenix, it's like 109. But then you get to Colorado, and it's like 36.
Yeah.
And you go, wow. I think people don't realize, even though there's lots of parts of the country over there that are in close proximity, the elevation changes so heavily that the weather's pretty drastically different in different areas that are kind of close by. But
yeah, it's true. I don't know the science behind it, but I think part of it has to do with, because of the fact that it's a valley, that like we tend to be like isolated. Like, everywhere you look, there's like mountains, like every direction there's something. And I think that like, I have no idea if this is even scientific, but I do feel like it's almost like we're in our own little like world. We have this kind of like barrier around us, and so like you said, it can be very different. Like, even if you just drive like an hour and a half north, it can drop like 20 degrees or something like that, like very easily.
Yeah, we were really confused looking at like the weather on our way up, because we were driving from Phoenix north to Sedona and elsewhere and stuff. You see like 20-degree change.
Yes. Yeah.
And the scenery doesn't change a whole lot, but the temperature will change pretty drastically. So
that Sedona was actually what I had in mind when I was saying that, because my wife and I love to go to Sedona. We've gone there like, more than a handful of times since we moved here a few years ago. And that's exactly what it is. Like, you barely even drive an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, and it's like a drastic drop in temperature.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of elevation and humidity, because where I live, it's very, very humid. So in the winters, it's super snowy, but then in the summers, like, it gets sticky, Whereas, where in your partly, if the humidity's low, yeah, it could be 109 during the day, but then it could get really cold at night
Yep.
too.
Yep.
So that humidity kind of keeps things around you know, kind of keeps things stable, and then the
Yeah.
elevation as well, I think adds to it. But
Yeah, I tell people that too. Like I feel like if you've never been here during the summer, that you kind of don't get it. And this is myself included. I had an uncle who grew up here, and I remember, and I say uncle like he married into our family. And I remember when I first met him, I was like, he was like, "Oh yeah, but it's a dry heat," and I was like, "Okay, it's just hot, like whatever." Because I grew up in the Midwest, and it wasn't until I came here during the summer one time that I was like, oh, I get it. This is different. Like it definitely is like a different type of heat when you don't have a lot of humidity. And it also is, I would say, much more bearable. Like when you were saying about it being 109, like that's probably the temperature where it starts to get uncomfortable. Because even when it's like 80, 90, 100 degrees here, it's hot, but it's not like uncomfortably hot. You just go outside and you're like, oh, yeah, it's
yeah,
hot out, and there's like
yeah,
there's a lot of relief in the shade too. You know.
yeah. My wife and I both agreed that we'd rather deal with 105 in Arizona than 85 here, because like
Yes.
we left in October, right? So we showed up
Mm,
off the plane, so it was like low 40s here. So we showed up off to the plane with like wearing sweatshirts and stuff,
yeah.
and like we just walked around like that fine. And if you're in the shade, it's fine. But I think that's
Yes.
that's another thing with that humidity. As soon as you walk from the shade to the sun, all of a sudden you go, oh, whoa, yeah,
Yep.
it's really
Yep.
hot. But
See,
yeah,
I love that you
85
said
here.
that.
Yeah, 85 here, sun, shade, doesn't matter. It's just you're going to be sweating and it's just going to be
Yeah.
sticking to you and it's terrible. But
That's exactly it. I'm sorry for anybody listening. I'm sorry we're just talking about the weather, but like this is a real thing. What you said is exactly true. Like it literally is like, would you rather be 85 degrees somewhere where it's humid or 105 where it's not? And it's like it is better here. Like it
yeah,
genuinely is better. It is easier to deal with. I think a lot of people like to complain about the heat here, but it's like we have it pretty good. I'm not
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
lie. And maybe they're just trying to stop other people from moving here because there's a lot of people moving here,
yeah,
myself included. But that could be the reason. But I was gonna say, first of all, like your podcast, that's such an interesting premise because I saw that you had a podcast and I knew the title, but I didn't realize that that was like what you guys do is just kind of like break down like a word. That's I feel like that's
yeah,
such an interesting like premise for a podcast.
yeah. So, and I mean, we don't always stick to that formula. Sometimes we tackle some different things, but
Sure.
usually, yeah, if you look at a lot of the episodes, it's just one word, two word things. So,
Eh,
and we go into breaking down the word itself, occasionally, where it originated and what the
mm,
different, antecedents of it are and things. So, yeah, sometimes it can get kind of technical. We try to keep it pretty down to earth so that anybody can listen in and learn something cool. But
yeah.
sometimes it gets a little crazy.
Well, that is really cool. The other thing I wanted to just like to kind of explore was this idea of like all these different things you're doing. So for a little bit of background, for me, I've always been that way as well. I've always just like had so much interest in so many different things, and a lot of people around me as I was growing up, like I will take responsibility for it. Like I did let people make me feel a certain way. So I'm not saying it's like, oh, it's their fault. But I feel like the people around me made me feel like like it was a bad thing. Like I had to pick a lane and stay in that lane and do that thing. And I will say, like, part of the reason probably was because like none of those things I ever did, like especially like many years ago, um, they weren't like paying the bills, right? And so I think for a lot of people, it was just like, bro, you got to focus and like do something to pay the bills. Like, stop messing around with this. Like, you're so impulsive. You're jumping from this thing to that thing. And that was kind of like my experience with it growing up. I always felt guilty about like being interested in so many different things until eventually I like full-fledged adult, like I'm just like, screw you guys, I'm doing what I want to do. And like that's just it. Like I everything you said is like the same. Like I have music that I've recorded and released. I have books that I've written and released. Like I have a podcast. I like there's just like all of these different, and like I feel like I could go on forever because it's just like limitless. But to me, now I look at it and I'm like, bro, isn't this like the whole point of life, is just to like experience all of these different things? Like there should not be any guilt about it. Like it should be exciting that like you have all of these different passions and interests. So I'm kind of just curious to hear like your take on all of that. Cause I feel like in the little bit that I know about you, I feel like you described yourself as a polymath, which to me says I've owned this, right? I'm not just like floundering and jumping around. It's like, oh no, this is who I am, you know? So I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that I agree with you a lot. I think that, almost everybody that I've ever met has said, something similar where, we live in a specialized world, or at least a specialized country, right? Where,
Mm,
um, nobody's making their own clothes or, building their own houses, that type of stuff, right? You go to work and you do one thing and they pay you for it. And then you pay somebody else to do all the other stuff.
mm-hmm,
Um, and yeah, that just seems like a really boring way to live, like, especially if you're not doing anything with those other 16 hours of your day.
mm,
I mean, 8 of them you got to sleep, right? Or,
true.
depending on the person. I need a lot of sleep, so I'll sleep 8 hours, 9 hours. But those other 8 hours, right? If you're not doing anything with those, then and you're just doing one thing that's your job, oh man, it seems unbearable, right? So
Mm-hmm.
um I think that it's important. Yeah, the most important thing is doing stuff that you like to do, and you can structure a life around that, and it's sure maybe you're not going to be rich, and you're not going to be famous, and but if you have what you need to survive,
Mm-hmm.
um, really that sense of joy and fulfillment you get from doing the things that you like to do makes up for whatever money you could put on top
Gosh.
of it, right? It
Yeah.
really doesn't matter, right? So if you got enough money to eat and you got a roof over your head, if the rest of the time you're doing stuff you want to do, then nothing else really matters,
Oh my
So
gosh.
um
Okay, hold on. I have to say something. So
yeah.
I love what you just said, and I feel like there's a really important distinction here, because one of the other things that I feel like was like a really prominent message when I was growing up is people being like, money doesn't make you happy. But on the flip side, being poor on its own does not just make you happy, okay?
Yeah.
Right? But if you are, and I'm saying the word poor, let's just say like you're not rich, okay? And you're kind of like just making enough to survive. Let's use that definition of poor. So like just being poor doesn't make you happy. But if you are being poor for the sake of being able to have a wide variety of experiences and do what you want to do, that is a totally different story. Because what I will say is like, I do believe that, like, I mean, the more money you have, the more potential happiness you can have, because of the fact that it gives you the opportunity to have more of the experiences you want to have. Okay. So I don't believe that like having more money doesn't make you, or makes you less happy. If anything, I think it gives you more potential to be happy. But on the flip side, that does not mean, oh, like when you're poor, you're just going to be happier because you're poor. It's like, what are you doing? Like if you're poor
Yeah.
for the sake of pursuing the things you want, then that makes sense, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and so you can sort of see these extreme circumstances. If you have like an Elon Musk who's the richest guy in the world, right? But he sleeps 3 hours a night and he spends the rest of the time working.
Yeah.
Unless he's really enjoying himself, and I'm not really convinced that he is, then what's the point in having all that money?
Yeah, sure.
But at the same time, if you're poor and you're miserable, then you're somebody you're not making good use of your time or
Yes.
skills, right? And
Yes.
so if you're somebody who's interested in a lot of stuff and you have a lot of skills, then even if you don't specialize, you can sort of um, combine your skills in such a way and sort of find opportunities for yourself
Mm,
to not be poor. And that's sort of what
yeah.
I've done, right? And
Yeah.
and I think that where a lot of people like that fit in is in management jobs of some type,
Mm,
because if you if you podcast, you deal with people. If you're going to school or making music, if you can draw on a bunch of different perspectives, then you
yeah.
can relate to a lot of different people.
Yes.
So your people skills, those kind of soft skills, build up, and then all you really have to do is just find a job where you can kind of stick with it until you can get promoted, and then you're in a pretty good spot. So yeah,
Oh my gosh.
it's just making good use of your skills,
Yeah.
and that's what I've done is I found a company where I really liked the culture of it,
Yeah.
and then just start at the bottom. And it didn't take very long to work my way up through until I'm
Yeah.
at the top of it essentially. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's yeah, if you're poor and you're miserable, then you really need to reevaluate what you're doing.
Don't be poor for the sake of being morally upright, because being poor does not make you better in any way.
Yeah,
Right?
and the flip side, right, is don't be rich just to have a legacy, right? Because
Exactly.
none of that stuff matters. 2,000 years from now, nobody's going to know who Elon Musk is.
Yep.
If any of us are still here, if the human race is still around, right, nobody's
Good
going to
point.
remember Elon Musk. And and 2,000 years is just an arbitrary number, but you can keep pushing it
Mm,
out now, and eventually none of us will be remembered for anything. So all you have is this present moment,
sure.
your life. So you need to make use of it in a way that you like doing it, right? So
Yeah. Well, it makes me think about how, so like two people can experience the same thing and like have a different experience through that same thing, right? And I sit there and I think, okay, if I was only alive for a day and someone else is only alive for a day, and I just spent it doing things that made me happy, and they spent it trying to make money, it's like, well, cool, that person ends up with money at the end of the day, but like, what was the point, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so like, it's not that money isn't important or it can't, like, again, provide you the potential for more happiness, but ultimately the whole point of it is to experience happiness. And the funny thing is that like, you could literally just do that now. Like, you could just
yeah,
do it right now.
yeah,
You don't need more
yeah,
money to do it.
yeah. As humans, we have to find this fine balance between um, living in the moment and also preparing for the future, right? Because you hear
Mm-hmm.
people say it a lot, like,
Mm-hmm.
"Yeah, live every day like it's your last." No, don't do that.
Well,
I'm
don't
not
wait.
cashing out my 401k,
Mm-hmm.
and buying a Ferrari because I know I have to live tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I could get hit by a bus today.
Yep.
So you can't be obsessed with the future because nobody knows what the future is. You don't know how
Mm-hmm.
long you're going to be here or what it's going to look like. Um, but at the same time, if you can't be solely focused on what's happening right now to the exclusion of future planning or future considerations, because you know if you're lucky that it will exist. So you have to have some kind of plan.
So you said you're finishing your master's right now in psychology or
My
PhD?
PhD, yeah,
I'm
yep,
sorry. I probably should have like mentally made a note of that. I just don't. So I haven't been to college, and so even just knowing like the difference between master's and PhD, I don't know. So I just like in my head, I'm like, oh, he's going to college for this. Can you explain it a little bit for me and anybody
sure,
else who maybe doesn't
yeah,
understand?
absolutely. So, going back to what we were saying about people kind of pressuring you into specializing, right? I've had an influence in my early life, my mom, right, who didn't do that. It was
Mm,
school wasn't just the 8 hours at the beginning of the day. You'd get out of school and mom would say, "Hey, let's go to a museum." And we'd
mm,
get there and she'd be like, "Hey, man, look at these dinosaur bones. Could you imagine if this thing was alive, how cool it would be?" And you're like, "Yeah." And then you run around reading placards and stuff. And she just
mm,
really did a good job of making me feel interested in everything. And so I
yeah,
think that's part of the reason though I am the way I am, right? That I
yeah,
like learning new stuff and I got a passion for education is because mom really, school was all the time. And
yeah,
if you take that approach rather than having it be something that you dread, a prison that you go to for 8 hours
mm,
a day, it just becomes a mindset that you apply to everything in life, right?
sure.
So when I went to college, in my associate's degree. So the first 2 years of college, I had a philosophy class and didn't really know what it was about. Something about dusty books and guys with big beards who are mad at the world, I guess. So, but the professor was fantastic. He didn't like assign textbooks. He assigned book books. So,
Mm,
and then most of the class time was spent just discussing stuff. So students would be standing up yelling at each other and taking
mm,
debates and stuff, and it was just cool. It seemed like really important, and so that between the two of those people, I just had a passion for school. Um, but going back to what we were just saying, I when I finished my 2-year degree and went to go for my 4-year degree, I saw the price tag and I go, I'm not taking out student loans, right? Because I'm planning
Sure.
for the future. I know
Sure.
what the future is, so I can't afford to pay that, so I'm not going. So I joined the army, right? And
Mm.
they paid for school, so I keep going forever. So I got an associate's degree, 2-year degree in criminal justice, got a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies, and then I got a master's degree in education, and now I'm getting a PhD, which is the highest level degree you can get in psychology. So
Wow. Wait, wait,
yeah,
wait. Are you saying that, because again, I didn't know this, but are you saying that they will pay for school forever? Like if you just wanted to keep going, like they would just keep paying for it?
no. So they provide you a set amount of money,
Oh,
but
okay. Okay.
they coordinate with the schools. So there's what's called a yellow ribbon school. So
Okay.
a yellow ribbon school that works with the military will cap your tuition at $250 a credit hour.
Okay.
So it makes it really, really cheap because like a PhD program would be like $1,000 a credit hour. So you're getting like
Okay.
a 75% discount.
Hmm.
So yeah, I pay for it now, but it's pennies on the dollar compared to what it would be. So
Interesting.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. So yeah, that's kind of my educational journey. It's kind of like the rest of my life. It's sort of all over the place and not necessarily coherent, but I've learned a lot of different things about a lot of different topics. And
Sure.
when I'm done, I'll probably just start something else.
Yeah.
So
No, that's pretty cool though. I will say, I think, you know, if someone just asked me like what my opinion of school in general was, what I'll say is that when I was in school as a kid, I always did really well. Like up until probably like high school, maybe. Um, I was getting like literally 100% in like probably every class. And then maybe once, yeah, I think it was maybe towards the end of middle school and it definitely into high school was when I started getting more like, B's and, and stuff like that. But I like, no joke, I was literally always getting like 100% in all my classes, and school always came really, really easily to me. Um, I would finish like homework in class before the class was released. The teacher would give it to us and I'd be like, I'm gonna do it right now. And I never prepared for tests. I'm not saying all this to brag. I want people to understand like I did well in school, but I still didn't like it. Right? So like a lot of people who like hated school, they also like didn't do well in it. And that's why I'm sharing
mhm.
all that, is because like I was really, really good at it. And I still was like, what was the point of that?
Mm.
And so, but at the same time, I also, as you can tell, have like a thirst for learning and I love learning. But I've definitely gone the more just kind of like self-directed route. Like I'll like, if I'm interested in something, I'll like read a book about it or like search stuff online and maybe watch a YouTube video or, buy a course about it or something like that. And so I think it's really interesting because I've always how can I say this? I feel like I've always been under the impression that a lot of people who go to school are doing it. And when I say school, I mean like college. That a lot of people, and maybe I'm wrong, but you would know because you've been there a lot. um, I get the impression that a majority of people who go to college are going because it is a requirement to do so for the career that they want, and not this from the place that you're coming from, where you're like, I love learning. And
Yeah.
I'm curious if that's what your impression has been as well.
Yeah, and it's not just my impression. I actually have statistics on it because,
Really?
well, yeah, like I said, my master's degree is in education, so this is something we kind of covered.
Oh yeah,
So
duh.
interestingly, yeah, there was a large scale study that was done in the 1950s where they asked college freshmen their reasons for attending college,
Mm.
and at that time, 54% of the students polled said that the reason they were attending college was to become a better, more well-rounded person. And
Mm.
when they ran that same study again 60 years later in 2014, it was less than, I think it was like 8%, something like
Oh
that
my
said that.
gosh.
And, the majority, right, was, yeah, I'm just here to get a piece of paper that says I can do a job.
Uh,
So yeah, it's job training nowadays, which is sad because that's not the original purpose of higher education, right? Back in the 50s,
Interesting.
yeah, back in the 50s, if you had asked any random college student why they were there, you had a better chance one in every two at
Yeah.
least would say, yeah, I'm just here to try to become a better person, which is
Wow.
sort of mind boggling. But
Wow.
the missing piece of that puzzle, right, is that the funding for college. So, like a Pell Grant is a
Okay.
really common grant that students use for school. And, I think I forget what it was. I think it's like $4,000 a year or something like that. So, um, nowadays that'll cover your books, for a year. Um, but it was the same amount of money in 1954 as $4,000. And that would pay for your whole
Mm.
education. So you could afford
Mm.
to just go to school and the government would pay for it. And so
Uh,
they're still giving you the same amount of money, but it hasn't been adjusted for inflation or anything like that. And so as a
uh,
result, it doesn't pay for anything.
man,
So
that's so interesting.
yeah, so
You know
it's
what that
kind of
makes me think is, would I have gone to college if it was paid for?
yeah,
And
right.
I think maybe I
Yeah,
would have. Maybe I
because
would
that's the thing. So
have.
and so it's a really tricky way, right, of the government saying, well, we haven't decreased funding for college,
Mm.
right? We're paying the same amount as we always have, but it hasn't been adjusted for inflation or anything, so it doesn't cover anything anymore. But yeah,
Wow.
back in the day, there was a lot of people that were going to school because it was mostly covered,
Okay.
and then people like you and me, right? I
Sure.
wouldn't I wouldn't have to join the army to go to college.
Good
It was
point.
the government was already paying for it, right? You would have been able
Good
to go
point.
and study what you wanted to do.
Mm.
And a lot of college courses back then were geared towards what we call basic research, whereas a lot of what we do today is called applied research. So
Mm.
basic research is studying new stuff, right? And if you think about that time period, post World War II, and how physics was going crazy, all the developments. I mean, we
Mm.
put dudes on the moon 60 years after we flew a plane for
Yeah.
the first time.
Yeah.
So basically new technologies were flourishing. There's just every day there was something new being invented, something new being made, because that's where majority of the research was. And nowadays, because the government stopped paying for college, most colleges are actually funded by businesses. But with that money comes strings attached saying,
Mm.
yeah, we don't want you to invent new stuff, because inventing new stuff is like an unknown commodity. We don't know if you'll actually come up with something. So we
And
don't
we
know.
don't know if you'll come up with something that puts us out of
Yeah.
business.
Yeah. So we don't know what our return on investment is. So what
Mm.
we want you to do instead is to focus your research on making the stuff that we already make better. And so you
Uh,
get, smaller cell phones, faster computers, more reliable cars, that sort of stuff. But in terms of
wow.
inventing new stuff, the money's not there anymore, because, you know, the government isn't just paying people like you and me to go to college and dream big and do, pursue whatever we want,
Wow.
and invent new stuff. It's really being funded a lot by businesses who are saying, hey, focus on this thing to make this better. So
Well,
that's kind of the
that's,
background.
man.
Yeah.
Okay, that is so eye opening. And I feel like it's amazing to hear, because I sit here and think like, oh wow. Like, okay, you know what it makes me think of is like, if you rewind back to like ancient times when it was like, oh yeah, these guys would get together at the whatever Acropolis or something like that, and they would just talk about big things. Like when you were describing your philosophy class, like that's kind of like, like, okay, if I understand correctly, that is essentially like why people were going to college in this 1950 thing, right? They just wanted to like, well, I want to just grow as a person and become more well-rounded and understand the world better and like have interesting discussions. And to me, I'm like, well, if that's what college was, like, yeah, well, I would have loved to go to college.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious if you think, because this is the first thing that popped into my head, because I get what you're saying about the funding. My other thought process on it is jobs started requiring degrees. And so instead of it being like, let's say it was like, oh yeah, if you have a degree, it would be more likely that you got a certain job. Okay, fine. But if it's now required, now this is not like an option. It's like, oh, well, if I want to have that job, now I have to go regardless of whether or not I feel like it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, a lot of it back then was just, hey, if you got a college degree, that just proved to your employer that, you had the work to, you could work through something and you could think critically and you
Mm,
could do that sort of stuff. And yeah, that was enough to get you a lot of jobs, right?
yeah.
Whereas nowadays, you need a very specific title, even in
Mm,
among similar degrees, right?
yeah.
You can't just go to school for engineering, right? if you do that, you'll never get a job, right? You have to be a glass engineer or a civil engineer or
Mhm.
you have to have something attached to that to that narrows your career field, right? Because again, we're living in a hyper specialized age where because of all of the the applied research, right? All the research we've done to make the things that we already have more efficient and more powerful. With that comes increased complexity, and so people have just a very small piece of any given picture, and you have to put all the puzzle pieces together to get a product.
So
Whereas,
interesting.
again, decades ago, even with something like a car, somebody, you could have Henry Ford and an assembly line. You could basically design a car with just a couple guys and put it together. Whereas nowadays, you
Mm,
have a whole team of engineers dedicated to just creating one, sheet metal panel,
mm,
So yeah, so it's yeah, we really are. I don't think there's any going back to the way that it was. I think
yeah.
that the way forward is going to be a lot of the free university stuff. Massive online, um, classes, that sort of thing. Uh, and really, that's just going to be for people who like to learn. There's no really no incentives beyond it the way that college sort of used to have. But
Interesting. So that's kind of where I started to like I said, I just will like if I'm interested in something, I'll like try to read a book about it or maybe like buy a course that someone's teaching about it. I'm curious like if you have any opinions about any of that. Like cuz obviously for you you're like, well, I'll get a degree in it because that's what I'm interested in, which is cool. I think that's cool. But like for you, especially me, I've never been to college. So I'm curious for you if you've ever explored that, like if you're just like, oh no, like I'm interested in this topic, let me read some books and take a course, and what the difference might be in your experience between that and being like, okay, I'm going to get a degree.
yeah, absolutely. There's I subscribe to the Great Courses Plus. So they have an app, and I'm always taking courses through there too while I'm taking courses uh in college, because it's
Uh,
just about random stuff. You can do history, you can do geography, you can do mathematics, you can do all kinds of different ones. And I think that that's definitely useful. I think that it's real
mm,
useful to pursue stuff that way. I think that the biggest difference between a formal college course or degree and kind of that piecemeal learning is what you do with it afterwards. Because
mm,
that's where a lot of real learning occurs. This is what I'm finding out with my psychology degree, right?
okay.
Psychology, there's the mental aspect of psychology, which is understanding how people think and all that. But there's
Hmm.
also the physiological aspect, which is understanding the different parts of the brain and what their functions are and how they work, and how learning occurs. And really how learning occurs is you have to use it. So there's definitely been some courses I've taken through the Great Courses Plus, right, where it's all right, I'm listening to it in the shower, all right, I'm listening to it on my way to work, all right, I'm listening to it here. And then I get to the end and I go, you know what, I don't really remember most of what
Mm,
I listened to. And so that's college, college courses, and also high school, and any formal education is
sure.
designed to test your knowledge, right? You have to take a
Mm,
test, or you have to write a paper, or you have to interact with your classmates in such a way uh, so that it's not just encoding, which is a fancy word for reading or listening, but it's also recalling. So pulling it back
mm,
up from your memory and seeing how much of it you can construct. And if you can't construct enough of it, right, going back and reading again and until you do.
mm.
Um,
Interesting.
so that part of it you can do, taking a great course or reading a book or any of that, but it has to be an active process. When you're reading a book, um, you don't just read it from cover to cover, but you read a paragraph and you stop and you go, okay, well, what did they actually say, and how does that apply to you know my prior knowledge, other things that I know
Mm,
about, and how would that apply in this circumstance, right? And just that simple exercise of active reading,
mm-hmm.
of saying, stopping for a minute and saying, okay, well, how does this actually connect to what my other perceptions and experiences in life,
Yeah.
is enough to sort of make it a little bit more salient.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that because like I think about when I like the stuff that I learned in high school, and I will tell you, like, I mean, it's got to be more than 99% of it I don't remember. Like, I mean, and it's because it's learning for the sake of learning, right? It's because, like, well, we told you you need to know this, but then I never actually like used those things, right? Like I don't do like any sort of complicated math past whatever age like you know what I mean? Like a really young age. It's like I don't do any of that. Like any of the other stuff, same thing. Like I'm glad I learned how to read, but again, all the stuff past that is like I don't remember any. I like, and maybe that's also just me because my wife remembers a lot of like the books that they read in school, and I'm like, I can't even remember the titles of the books that I read in my English classes. Like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and I did good, right? Again, this is coming from someone who got like 100% in their classes. So
Yeah.
that's something that popped in my head when you were saying this is like, that is really, really interesting because it's true is that like if you are learning just for the sake of like, oh, I just want to take it in, it's like if you don't have something to apply it to, it really doesn't stick because it doesn't have a reason to stick. There's this guy that he I don't know, he has like a couple courses and stuff, and I don't think I've bought any of his courses, but I read like his newsletters and stuff. And that's one of the things he talks about is like not learning just for the sake of learning, but like having a project to work on and then start, right? And then you realize, oh, I need to know this. And then you go learn about that thing and then you apply it to the project. And so now you've actually learned the thing, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's not just going in your brain, like in one ear and out the other. You're taking it in, applying it, and then you just keep going until there's something else. Oh, I don't know this. I need to understand this. Let me go read a book about it or take a course or whatever it might be.
Yeah. That was basically my experience with music, right? Is, I didn't, I had a weird journey there, right? I didn't really listen to music as a kid.
Okay.
I just didn't care. And then when I was like a teenager, my friends were all like, yeah, let's start a band. None of us play any instruments, so we'll just pick them randomly. And so I
Okay.
got guitar. So I taught myself how to play guitar. Everybody
Yeah.
taught themselves how to play stuff and sucked for a long time, but then eventually got pretty good and played some shows and battles of the
Mm-hmm.
bands and things. And then my bass player moved out of state to go to college, and my drummer got married really young. And so the band broke up. And I was like, man, I'm just starting to get into music. I hate to just not do anything. And so,
Yeah.
19, I was like, I just went to Guitar Center and blew my life savings on buying a drum set, buying a keyboard, buying the mics,
uh,
buying the interface, all that stuff, and just figured it out, right?
yeah.
Nobody ever taught me how to play any instruments. Nobody taught me how to record or do any of that. But like you said, just, hey, there's a bunch of different skills are needed, and I'm going to figure it out. And so
Yeah.
what determines success and failure in these things is motivation, right? And motivation
Mm-hmm.
can have a number of different sources. And so in school, the difference, because I'm very much like you, right? I always did very well in school, and I never applied any effort, So, um, and so I liked it. So it was. I think I remembered a little bit more, but motivation. Some people their motivation can be, I want to do well, and so they study really hard, and
Mm-hmm.
even though it's not fun, they want to do well, and so they remember the stuff, right? And then there's other people who, yeah, maybe they don't have to study hard. They're just going to do really well, and they don't really care about the stuff, so it's kind of in one ear and out the other.
Like just remember
Um,
it just long enough to be able to pass the test on
yeah,
it.
but the most important part, and I actually just recently wrote a 25-page paper on this, is the most powerful motivational sort of component is interest enhancement, right? So
Mm,
interest enhancement and academic self-concept are the two things. So how do you think of yourself as a student, right? And if you think of yourself as somebody who's
mm,
capable of learning and capable of succeeding, and you're also interested in the thing that you're learning, you're
mm.
almost unstoppable, right?
Wow.
You're gonna do well. And there's a ton of scientific studies that have demonstrated this over and over again. It's a highly replicated finding. And so
Wow.
I think that just sort of is something that's kind of that's defined me a little bit throughout my life. Is I'm just somebody who, for better or worse, is very easily interested in almost anything. Like people will just say something, and it's one of those things. You'll overhear somebody just having a
Mm,
regular conversation,
mm.
and all of a sudden I'll go, "Oh, wait a minute! Like, what does that? Where'd that come from?" And you're pulling up Google, and then you're down a rabbit hole
Yes.
trying to figure it out. And if
Yes.
you're somebody who you believe, hey, yeah, I'm going to figure this out eventually, and it's something that you like, then you figure it out.
Okay. Okay. Now that's really interesting because what I will say is that even though when I was younger, I looked at school as like, what was the point of that? Right. I definitely did. But I also will say that when I was in class, um, and this isn't surprising because this is how I am as an adult, exactly what you just said, where like someone will just say some random thing and I go, where did that come from? Wait, who did that first? And like, why did that start? Right. So like, I've always had this kind of like inquisitive mind. And so things with school, like, maybe some weird math thing that I don't use now, it's like, what is that for? Well, wait, why does that make sense? Why does that work when you do this thing? And so like, there definitely was a certain amount of, see, it's funny. I wouldn't call it interest, like as in like, oh man, I'm just so interested in math. But it's more like an inquisitiveness that I had, and coupled with that thing that you mentioned of like believing, like, oh, I can figure this out. And I feel like I've carried that, especially that second attitude, like through my life, like so many different places. I'm always just like, whatever, I'll figure it out. Whatever, I'll figure it out. And I don't know where it came from. Um, Maybe my parents telling me I could, or I don't know. I really don't know. I actually wish I did know because I want more people to believe that because I think everybody can figure it out. I think they
Yeah.
just don't believe that they can.
Well, the interesting thing about academic self-concept is that there's a reciprocal bidirectional relationship with success, right? So, and as a matter of fact, they don't even really know which comes first in the literature. Whether being successful causes you to believe you're a good student, or whether believing you're a good student causes you to be successful. They don't know which comes first, but they do know that they affect each other. So I think that's the problem that a lot of people get in life is that, if you fail early at something, then your self concept, what you believe about yourself and your ability, can get kind of drastically impacted, and then you either choose to um, not invest yourself in being interested because you're afraid of getting hurt, or you just believe that you're going to fail and you don't even bother putting in the effort to begin with. So um, I think that there's some of that just based off of the self talk that I hear people say when
Sure.
because when I talk to people about stuff that I do, everybody acts really impressed. And I'm always like, there's no reason you should be impressed. Anybody could do any of the
Oh my
stuff that I do. Like,
gosh.
there's nothing that I do that's
Bro, the
cool
more
or
you talk, I'm like, we're the same person. Because I literally tell that to people. People are like, wow, you can play guitar and you can sing and you can play piano and play the drums. I'm like, so can you. Like, I didn't, but it's so funny because like people will be like, wow, like, so there's two things. Okay, two things. First of all, people go like, wow, you're so talented. That's amazing. I could never do that. And I just go and I'm like, okay, so like, yeah, let's just disregard all like the practice and everything I did to get to where I am right now by just saying it's innate talent. And second of all, you could do this too.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not just me. Like you could literally do the exact same thing that I did. It's not anything crazy. Like you just have to believe. And it's see, it's so funny. Like you're like, I have these statistics and here are these like big words and it's good. I love it. I love it because it backs up everything I'm saying. But like when I say it, I'm like, you just need to believe in yourself. And people are like, whatever, right? Like writing it off. And it's just funny because like if I could say it the way you say it, people would be like, that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I
And they
was
would take it
actually,
seriously.
yeah, I was actually just reading a thing by a performance psychologist who was saying that he doesn't believe innate talent even exists. Like he doesn't believe that there's any such thing as innate talent. He's like, even if you look at genetic predispositions and that sort of stuff, like yeah, sure, like if you're taller, you have a better chance at being a good basketball player, but your basketball skills aren't tied to your height. They're not really tied to any intrinsic. I mean, you think about
Yeah.
like Prince being an excellent basketball player and the dude was like 5'6" or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
So from this guy's point, and I mean, he's a PhD, so he's at the top of the field. He coaches Olympic athletes and professional football players and stuff. And he said, talent doesn't exist. It's made up. It's a fake thing, right? All you have to do is be interested in something and like you said, practice at it. But even practice, right? Practice is an important aspect. And I always go out of my way to point this out to people, like, I practice with a certain intention, right? When I'm playing guitar, like it's not like I'm sitting there practicing chords and flying through scales and going like,
Oh,
because in
yes.
my mind, right, that creates ruts in your brain where you go, okay, well now I'm just falling back on this stuff and all right. That's good when you're first starting, right? Create the muscle memory, create all that stuff so you know it's there. But after that, practice should really be stretching your creative muscles, right? Sitting
Mm.
down and going, all right, I'm going to try to play something that I haven't played before. And I'm, a lot of it's going to be junk, but I'm going to come up with something. Then once I have that cool riff that's like, yeah, I've never done that. Now you can go back and go, okay, well, what sort of scales and chords might I structure this with to make something
Mm.
new and different?
Yes.
So practice shouldn't be just the rote memorization, just the, all that stuff. It should be when you're first starting, right? If you're first picking up the guitar, first picking up the drumsticks, whatever it is, yes, practice your chords, practice your scales, get the calluses on your fingers, all that stuff. After that, no, don't sit down and just fly through stuff, right? Try to write new
Mm.
things because that's how you get better.
Yeah, it's so funny. It makes me think of the same thing I was saying before about like having a project. It's like for the purpose, like learn for the purpose of completing a project. And it's like I didn't even realize this before, but that's exactly how I learned guitar. Like I just picked a song that I wanted to learn, and like every next song that I picked that I wanted to learn was like a slightly higher difficulty or like had a different like technique or skill involved in playing it. You know what I mean? And then it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so then you learn it because you're trying to complete, right? I don't think of it as a project. It's just like, I want to be able to play that song. And so you just learn what you need to learn in order to play that song. And like, I gained experience in all of these different instruments and all of these different ways of playing the instruments and specific skills within the instruments simply because I was just picking songs. I just would literally pick the next song that I wanted to learn and then learn that thing. And so then you end up with this like diverse skill set within, like, let's say playing, like being able to play guitar, you end up with this like diverse skill set within that ability. And again, people look at you and they're like, oh, like, wow, you're so talented. I could never do that. And I'm just like, this is hilarious because all I did was just pick a new song. Like, all I
Yeah.
did, that's the whole way that I learned. I just kept
Yeah.
picking new songs.
Yeah, you took something you were interested in and you believed you could do it, and then you did it, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's good about learning that way is that it redefines your relationship with failure that you can't do in a formal education setting, right? In
Mm,
school, if you fail, you get a bad grade and then it's always there, right?
mm.
Whereas if you start a new project, right? For me, it's 3D printing, right? I got a 3D printer a couple of years ago and I could not get anything good to print for months. I was tearing the thing apart and replacing parts and, recalibrating this and doing that and just mostly doing a whole lot of swearing. And just, it was just failure after failure after failure after failure.
Yeah.
But each time I learned something new about how the
Yeah.
machine worked, about how
Yeah.
the thing went. And, now I can make flawless prints, without thinking about it because
Sure.
of all those steps, right?
Sure.
You can't imagine that same process happening in school. It'd be like if
Uh,
they give you a test and you get a 60 and you get a 60 and you get a 60 and you get a 60. Well, by the end, you get to the end of the year, right? You're either failing or you're getting a D or something, and your self concept of how you feel as a student is shot. When in reality, you haven't failed until you've stopped failing, right? As long as
wow.
you're continuing to learn something new, you're learning, and
Yeah.
and you'll get somewhere eventually.
Holy cow.
But it's hard for that to happen in a formal education setting.
That is I mean, that's crazy, and I love it. I think actually the guitar thing is also like just a perfect example because I never like let's say I'm like, okay, the first chord for this song is a C, and I've never played a C chord before. If I put my finger on the wrong fret, like, and then I just said, oh no, I put my finger on the wrong fret, I suck at this. You're like, what? That is literally just part of learning how to play. You put it on the wrong, just move it over one, like, or move it down one. Like, my point is that, like, oh man, I love what you said because it's so true. Like, if you are defining what you're doing by your failures, like, you're missing the point. Like, it is literally, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. You just blew my mind when in this conversation because it's like when I related it to the guitar playing thing, it just was like, wow, that is like the perfect analogy because everybody always thinks like, oh no, I failed, I can't do it, and you're like, it shouldn't even be called failure. It should not even. It's literally just the path to getting good. That's all it is.
Yeah,
But like you said, in a formal education setting, it is literally like, well, like we're scoring you. And like you said, this is going on the record. This will
Yeah,
always
yeah,
be on your record. Imagine if someone was watching you play guitar and go, oh, you played that note wrong. This is on your record forever. I don't remember all the times I played a note wrong. That's
yeah,
insane. That's
yeah,
completely
exactly.
insane.
Right. So learning is just the natural, or failing is just the natural part of the learning process. That's
Yes.
how human beings learn. Nobody just does something the first time and is a master at it, right? No, and this is all intuitive. Everybody knows
Duh.
this,
Right?
right?
Like, duh.
Yeah, no, we're not dropping any bombshells here, but I think that it's just the way that our culture and our society and our educational system is structured in such a way that we, as Americans, we just have it in our heads that failure as a concept is this big bad thing out there and that we have to
Mm,
avoid at all cost. And I think that's what really stops people from pursuing new things in a lot of ways.
sure, sure. Well, I feel like the typical formal education system is not built for the purpose of becoming like ultimately, like we said, if you're like, okay, I want to be a master at playing guitar, it's not built for that. Like it's built to score you along the way to becoming that. And ultimately, like you will carry those grades with you and it literally will affect the rest of your life. So it's like I get why people are afraid of failure because that's literally like if you keep failing and you don't get better and it just continues to add up, by the time you graduate high school, you have a low GPA, you can't get into a good college and get a high paying job if that's, the path you envision for yourself. It's like so I get why so many people are afraid of it.
Yeah, and most importantly, you think of yourself as somebody who's incapable of learning, when in
Yes.
reality everybody just has a bunch of different learning styles, right? Like I'm
Yes.
actually I think of myself as being a pretty slow learner.
Mm.
Honestly, like, because when I'm reading stuff, I have to stop a lot. I'll stop a lot and reread a sentence, and because I'm just questioning myself and questioning what I'm reading until I know I understand it.
Mm.
And so it takes me a long time, but eventually I'll get there. But sometimes you run out of time, because of the way it's scheduled, because school says, hey, you should know this by now, and if you don't,
Mm.
well, you're not
You're
going to
not
get it. You're not going to be
qualified.
great, right? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of added pressure to the formal education
So
system.
I'm sure then okay, hold on. Because I want to, I have a specific question, but I want to just wrap around right back to this real quick. So the thing that you originally mentioned about college, um, about how it was kind of like a place to just become more well-rounded and how I told you, like, it made me think about like, in ancient times when people would go and just discuss things. I think just like I have that draw to like, oh man, I would love it if college was just that. And if it was paid for by the government, that'd be amazing. I think that is part of my draw to a lot of I guess you could call it self help, right? Like books, courses, all of that stuff. Because what it feels like to me is it's like it's almost the same thing. Like I imagine I'm going to a place and someone's telling me their thoughts about XYZ subject and I'm learning something new from it, but I also know it's just their perspective and it's not like, I don't have to take everything. I can just hear it and go, "Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that makes sense. I disagree with that, but I'm glad they mentioned it because now I'm clearer on what I think about that subject now." I think that's like my draw to that. And I'm only saying that now and explaining it because I think a lot of people when they hear self-help book or like, oh, you bought a course online, like you got scammed, like
Mm,
you need a real education, you got to get a degree, blah blah. It's like I'm not doing that for the same reason that someone is going to college right now, like right in the
yeah,
2014 study. I'm not taking these courses and reading these books with the same motivation as the people who are going to college. Is like for me, I'm doing it because of the people from 1950, right? It's
yeah,
like I'm trying to be a more well-rounded person. I like learning, I like hearing different perspectives, and I like refining my thoughts and my perspectives. And so like hearing other people, it's kind of like that idea of like, oh, I'm just going to this like Acropolis and like hearing what other people are thinking. And I don't know,
yeah,
you
yeah,
understand what I'm
yeah.
saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the important thing is just being able to vet where you're getting your information from to know that it's good.
Mm, mm,
But after that, no, I think that it does serve the same purpose. And I've said this on a couple other podcasts that really podcasting kind of is that form. Podcasting is the modern
mm,
Acropolis, right? Because why do people listen to podcasts? And if you think about that question, my thought is that a lot of these deeper conversations like you and I are having
Hmm.
don't happen in the real world anymore. Like I'm lucky enough that I
Mm.
remember a pre-technology world, right? And I
Yes.
remember being a teenager and kind of sitting on the hood of my car with my friend at 3
Yes.
a.m. looking up at the stars and thinking like, hey, do you think God exists?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
kids don't do that anymore, I don't
So
think.
true.
And so where do they turn? They turn to the internet, and they find podcasts. They find like guys like you and I talking, and
Yeah.
they're engaging in those conversations, even though they're not partaking in them as an active participant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that that's sort of the niche that it fills. But
Wow.
along with that, right, comes where you're getting your information from. So, podcasting has sort of a there's sort of a toxic connotation with it with some regards, where
Yeah.
because some of the people and some of the people on the biggest stage, right,
Yeah.
don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so, you know, they have all these viewers, you got a billion
Uh,
people listening to a guy spout off some nonsense, and everybody goes, oh man, what a waste of time. Um,
mm,
so knowing where your information comes, that's an important part of it. But even if you don't, like you said, if the responsibility for learning is on the learner. So if you
mm.
go in and you listen to one of these guys, you can actively listen and go, okay, yeah, that's a good point. That one is a bunch of garbage. That one
That's some
that one
bullshit.
actually, yeah, exactly. That one changes the way that I thought about something else. So you
Yes.
can take pieces of what you believe and you can push the rest aside.
Yeah.
The danger is if you're somebody who's impressionable and or unwilling to put in the work of thinking of themselves, and
Sure.
you just listen to these people and just take everything wholesale and say,
Mm.
"Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah, this is what I believe now is what they told me." Well, that's not it's not actually learning. That's just adopting somebody else's whole
So true.
beliefs and perspectives, and that's intellectually disingenuous, right?
Totally.
So it's on the responsibility of the learner to know where you're getting your information, right? And to
Yeah.
really think about it for yourself and what do you believe, what don't you believe, what's true and what's not. But I think
Yeah.
that podcasting is filling that void that the Acropolis, right? Or
Yeah.
the Academy, Plato and Aristotle's academies and that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. It's you and I now, which is a little scary, I think, but it's cool. It's cool.
Yeah, no, I see. I love that you mentioned the podcasting because I'm sitting here talking about books and courses and stuff, but it's like, oh yeah, duh, like podcasts, like that's exactly what it is. And I totally agree with you. Like what you mentioned about like we're probably similar age. I remember too when I was a kid. Like now I sit here and I go because whenever I'm like bored, right, I just open up my phone and I'm like, oh damn, when I was a kid, I was just bored. Like I would just start thinking about stuff. I'd look at something. I start like just interacting with the world around me. And it's like now that's not the case. Like now it's like you have a free second, you just pick up your phone and you check your apps. And I do feel like it's really important, but I agree with you. I think that is part of the draw of podcasts. Not only because, again, like the Acropolis thing, that in itself at that time was a draw, but also because right now people aren't having those conversations because they aren't just sitting. They're not just like sitting doing nothing. And I can't speak for everybody, but I just say like that is the overall pattern that you see. There is no just kind of like sitting around doing nothing. You always, it's like, even if you are sitting doing nothing, because I've experienced this too, like somebody in the room wants the TV on too. And so it's like,
Mm.
I can't even just exist and have a conversation without someone be like, what do you guys want to do? Do you guys want to watch TV? You want to watch a movie? And I'm just like, can we just like exist? Like, can we just talk? So I'm getting that through, through this podcast. But
Yeah.
yeah, great points. Great points.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, technology, it's a tool, right? And so
Hmm.
tools in them of themselves are not good or bad. It's
Yeah.
in their usage of them by
Yeah.
people. So yeah, I have nothing against technology, right?
Agreed.
I build computers and I do podcasting and I do a whole bunch of stuff that's technology heavy.
Yeah.
But like you said, do I spend a lot of time scrolling social media? I don't do a lot of passive technology
Mm.
because for the very reason you're saying, right? I think that, well, an important part of the human brain, right? Psychology is learning extends far beyond what you and I have been talking about in this conversation, right? Drug addiction is actually a form of learning, right? All of the same
Mm.
chemicals that cause you to feel high when you're on drugs. What that is just an overload of chemicals that are also in play when you learn stuff. And so when you take drugs and you get that super high feeling, it's your brain learning that this is something that we want, and
Mm,
that's how addiction happens.
yeah.
Same thing with technology, right? When you're passively scrolling, those same chemicals that are helping you to learn that, hey, this is something that reinforces something
Mm,
that I feel, right? And it causes you to
interesting.
the behavior to become addictive. So yeah, it's best to not hijack those systems, right? Keep your learning molecules to things that are actually helping you, actually
Yeah.
things that are worth learning to some
Yeah.
extent. But
Okay. So before I took this branch, the thing I was going to say to you before, you have a master's in education, and it seems that from what we've talked about that you agree that like it's not like the formal education system is not exactly built to truly get someone to the point of learning something, i.e., learning guitar. I learned this. I'm not keeping track of my failures. I'm just trying to work on this next project. So I'm curious, and I guess I could just assume that you've given this some thought because you have a master's in education. Is like, how would you fix that? And like, would you fix it, or do you feel like there's like some sort of other path or way to start over or do something? I'm just curious what your thoughts are as far as like the formal education system goes with regard to what we talked about and its effectiveness.
yeah, yeah. From personal experience, I think that the biggest thing that you could do to help, that's realistic, right? We're not pie in the sky. You really could do this, and it really would make a big difference.
Okay.
Would be to reduce the stakes of any given assessment.
Mm,
So rather than there should be no tests that determine whether or not you lose a whole grade point. You know, um,
mm,
so rather than having in other words, a bad course, right? A bad college course, you have just a midterm and a final. Those are your only two tests, and that determines your whole grade, right? A good course would be, hey, every week, we're going to do a 5-question test, and every week we're going to write a 2-page paper, and each one of those is going to be worth 5% of your grade, right?
mm,
And then all of that adds up because that allows those intermediate steps that we talked about for guitar playing in, right?
mm,
Where, okay, so maybe in week 1 you don't do so well on the first test, right? You get 4 out of 10 questions right. But maybe your paper shows your teacher that, hey, you're just not a good test taker, but you do know what you're talking about. Well, then come week 2, you go to take the test again. Well, you're a little bit less nervous because you took one last time, and you've had a whole week to go, and it allows you to see some progression, right? It's kind of like creating a graph. You know, if you have a graph and you're trying to connect the dots, right? Let's do connect the dots and make a picture of a dinosaur, but there's only 2 points. It doesn't make any
mm.
sense, right?
Yeah.
If you do connect the dots and you have 200 dots, well, you can actually draw a pretty nice stegosaurus.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same thing with learning, right? You're trying to triangulate your mind around a concept, right? You're
Mm.
trying to develop some sort of knowledge. And so
Yeah.
the more frequent an assessment is, the more likely somebody is to learn, and also the less likely any single grade it is to affect their whole self-esteem or their whole ability to succeed in the course on a grade level term, that type of thing. So I think that
That's
would be
interesting.
I think that'd be the best first step. Is I think a lot
Like
of
a
people
step in the right direction.
yeah, I think a lot of people right offhand would be, oh, more tests or oh, more papers. But I think that it would really help sort of redefine people's relationships with testing and with paper writing,
Mm.
to have it more frequently, to just have it be a regular part of what we're doing every day,
Yeah.
as well as student interaction. What they've found is that academic self-concept is heavily influenced by people's abilities to interact with their peers regarding stuff that they're learning.
Mm.
So if your teacher just sits up there and talks to the whole class all day, and then you take a test, you're going to do a lot less well than if your teacher talks for 10, 15 minutes and then lets students talk amongst themselves about it. As long as it's structured, right? As long as they
Sure.
are actually talking about what they learned, you get to bounce ideas off of each other. You get to,
Mm.
and, you know, hey, it's an in-person podcast,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, it's
Like,
like the
oh,
real
okay.
world. Like
Yeah. All right.
that's how
Yeah.
the real world
Exactly.
operates. We don't
Exactly. Right.
just
Like,
sit and all face the front and say our,
yeah.
take our
So you can
tests.
say, all right, yeah, no, what you said is something that I didn't know. And then this other thing that you said was wrong. So let me correct you on that. And so you're
Mm,
using each other's knowledge to kind of refine your own to some extent. So
yeah.
if, if just those two things could get implemented well, I think that that would go a long way towards fixing things to some extent. But
Yeah. So so I have thought about like, oh, what could you do differently? I never thought about this that I'm going to share. But in what you were describing, what it almost makes me think of, and this is if it was like a major overhaul thing, I don't know exactly all the details of how it would work, but it would almost make more sense for it to be like an accumulation of positive points as opposed to like measurements out of 100 every so often, right? But imagine if it's like you need to accumulate 100 points and then you get to move past this class, and that could happen very quickly if you're a fast learner, and it might take a lot longer if you're a slow learner. But there is no negative points, right? It's like
yeah,
as you learn things, great, you learned this point, right? And it's
yeah,
like, oh, perfect, you learned this next part of this thing, fantastic. And it's just like a path that you go down instead of a like, oh, we're measuring you along the way, and well, these negatives are counting against you,
yeah.
um
Yeah, no, that is a great idea, and it is one that they have thought about. It's almost more of like it's sort of like a video game scoring concept, right?
it
Where like you
is.
play through a level and it's like, yeah, well, you missed a couple checkpoints, or yeah, you didn't get enough of this or whatever, so you have to play again.
Mm,
And they have implemented some versions of that in a couple of European countries, I think, and there's
interesting.
been talk about it. So, but yeah, it sort of removes that negative connotation with grades, right?
Yeah.
That negative part. So no, that's a really good
Well,
suggestion.
and it turns it into, what, well, I guess I don't know enough about Montessori schools, but the reason why that popped in my head is because I know that they like will mix ages up. And so it kind of makes me think of the same thing. It's like, it feels like it's not feasible because you're like, well, what about like some kids are going to take forever and some kids aren't? And it's like, okay, well, yeah. But if you have like, like a school, like let's say it's like, kindergarten to eighth grade, right? Like whatever you learn from kindergarten to eighth grade, and you just had like groups of teachers that teach this subject, and the kids all just came in with those groups of teachers, and they're getting them along to their points, and some kids move quickly through it and they get to move on to another class or whatever. And it's like then you would have kids with all different age groups, which again is just like the real world. Like you're not only interacting with your own age group, there's like interactions between each other. It's cumulative instead of like, oh, like you failed, so like now you get a bad grade. It's like, no, you just keep doing this until you get it, right? It's not like, oh, you spent the allotted amount of time and you just don't get it, so we're giving you a D. Right? Instead of just like, no, we believe in you, everyone can get this, everyone can understand this, even you, right? And like it might take you a little bit longer, but that's okay, like it doesn't matter, like the point is just that you get it.
Yeah, and something that occurred to me too, sort of in that same perspective of Montessori schools, would be um, just because I've seen this happen with my educational path, right? When I'm looking at the stuff that I'm learning as a PhD in psychology versus in my, you know, Psych 101, the very first psychology course I took back in my associate's degree, the subject matter that you're learning about isn't all that different, but it's the level of detail, right?
Mm,
And so that's something you sort of integrate into those types of schools, as if, rather than having a special ed or a gifted department that separates people from their peers and reduces that contact,
mm-hmm,
everybody's in the same class, but the teachers provide different levels of detail for different students depending on how well
mm,
they've achieved thus far, right?
yeah,
And so if you have somebody who's really struggling, hey, here's the basic concepts of what it is we're trying to teach you. And then if you have somebody who's doing really well, they're still learning about the same thing. It's still the same lesson plan, but you're giving them more details, more complexity, more things to help them flesh out their
mm,
understanding. Um, and that helps because that's been one of the main complaints about the type of thing that you're talking about is, well, how do you keep track of what kids wear, what they're learning?
mm,
And so, yeah, rather than within a single subject like history, okay, well, instead of saying, oh, okay, well, hey, I'm trying to teach these kids the Revolutionary War, but then this other kid that's done really well, he's all the way up to World War I. Well, no. Instead of having them switch time frames, just have, okay, well, this kid's learning the Revolutionary War. He's struggling. Let's just make sure he's got the years right and the big figures. But
Mm,
this kid who's doing really well, he'll still learn about the Revolutionary War. But now we're going to talk about specific battles and other
mm.
things, more details. And so that helps sort of keep people on the same page.
So
But
interesting.
yeah. So I think that there's definitely some areas that could be modified in a
That's kind
sense.
of cool to think about. I'm sorry. I never really like gave this like really fleshed out an idea like that, but it's like that actually be really cool. Like imagine that like there's just like a big space, right? Like I say a classroom, but a classroom's too small. But like let's say it's just like a big space and you have like all of the history teachers are there, right? And like this teacher teaches is like the basics of history. If you haven't been able to, that's like where you start, right? It's just like the basics, like you said. Just talk about the dates and who was involved, and then this teacher handles like a little bit more depth as far as that goes, or and this teacher handles like this location or whatever. And same thing with math, all the other ones where it's just like everyone's there in the same space, just learning from the different teachers. And as you go, oh, okay, cool. And I'm like, okay, you can go talk to that teacher now. You've made it this far, and it doesn't matter, right? It's not linear that someone could be like, oh, you're so far behind me. It's like, no, we're all in the same space. We're just learning our own things, Sorry, I tend to go down these rabbit holes, but it's just like to me, I look at it as I went to school and it worked really well for me. Like I learned very easily and that was fantastic. But like I want other people to be able to like I don't want them to get good grades. I want them to love learning, right? Like
Mm.
I feel like the more people that love life and are interested in life and want to learn more things, like the better the world's going to be. Like cuz I sit here and think like wow, all the things that I have learned, like my life is full, but also like I'm able to help other people with the things I've learned. Imagine if everybody did that. Like
Yeah,
imagine if everyone was pursuing like the things that were interesting to them and like wanted to learn more and like cared about making an impact, which I feel like happens as you learn more. And so to me, I'm just like, how can we facilitate the learning of more people? And not in a way of like you said, like, well, I'm measuring you against everyone else or measuring you. And like at the end of this, you're either qualified or not. It's like, no. Like, how do we just instill like this love of learning in people? And I do think that part of it just comes down to like the structure, like the way that school is built. And so, yeah, that's why I've thought a lot about this concept because I would love to see that in the world.
yeah. And I think, like I was saying, I think it comes back to a couple things, and that's just getting students interested in the subject matter
Yeah.
and then facilitating the concept of themselves as somebody who can achieve stuff.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it opens a lot of doors. How I got into local government was the mayor listened to my podcast, right? And he
Really?
goes, yeah, uh,
What?
yeah, he goes, yeah, I was listening to your podcast and you sound like a guy who, likes thinking about the details of stuff and, is really deep and kind of insightful. Um, I've got a position open. It's normally elected, but the person in it stepped down. So I can appoint somebody until the next term. Would you be interested? And I'm like, yeah, sure.
What?
And so, yeah, I got in that
Wow.
way. And,
Wow.
yeah, and it's interesting, right? It's very interesting to see how running a municipality works and what all's involved with it, and how and it's the biggest place where you can make a difference in other people's lives, right? Make
Mm.
people's lives better. And much like we've been talking about with education, right? The pitfalls of education and how the concept of learning and becoming educated is important, but is been sort of stripped of that by the structure. It's the same
Mm.
thing with politics, right? Like
Mm.
politics is so poisonous and terrible at the higher, at the federal level. But if you think about it as a concept, uh, what's the main purpose of it? It's supposed to be making people's lives better, right? It's supposed to
Yeah.
be thinking about how to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool on a smaller local level to be able to do that, and to be able to be a registered independent and not have people say, well, you have to choose a side or you don't belong, that sort of thing.
Mm.
It's just, no, we're going to look at you for your merit, not what your political party is. And, yeah, we think you can make a difference. It's kind of cool. But
Interesting. Interesting. Well, Joel, this has been like an awesome conversation, man. I'm so glad that we got connected and that we had it. Is there anything that you want to share before we wrap up? I know you told people the name of your podcast. If you want to share it again, or any way that if they want to connect with you.
Sure. Yeah. If anybody wants to listen to the show, it's From Nowhere to Nothing. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to listen to my music, you can just look up my name, Joel Bouchard, and you can find it on Apple Music, Spotify, wherever. Yeah, and that's about it.
Amazing, man. Well, like I said, I really appreciate you coming on, and yeah, hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who'd appreciate it. For everything I have to offer, visit howtobeaperson.co.